My name is Salma Sirri. I'm a researcher, food researcher, and I usually document and archive and study food and share with on social media on Sufra Kitchen. That's where you probably follow me, not my personal page. But I'm delighted to be your host tonight and have this wonderful discussion that I've been really looking forward to with Mennat-Allah El Dorry for a while now. I've been a follower, a big fan of Minna's work, and I've been following her content on Instagram, Eat Like an Egyptian Instagram account for a while now, getting really inspired and always learning something new. So welcome, Minna.
Thank you, Salma. I'm very excited about our chat today.
And I am really excited again to welcome you, Minna, and welcome everyone who has joined us tonight in our conversation. Minna is an Egyptologist who is specialized in archaeobotanical analysis. Much of her research has revolved around food and trying to reconstruct how people in the past cooked and ate. She's currently editing the proceedings of an international conference on food in Egypt and Sudan that she organized in 2018 in cooperation with the Institut Français d'Archaeologie Orientale and the Polish Center for Mediterranean Archaeology. And I myself have always been going back to Rawi's Cultural Heritage Review magazine that Minna was the editor guest. Correct me if I'm wrong, Minna?
Yes, I was the guest editor of Rawi's food issue.
Which was it is a beautiful work, really, really rich and full of amazing information that really pieces together and create a beautiful narrative and a story of food in Egypt from the early days of the ancient civilization.
That's what we wanted to do, so I'm glad to hear that.
Of course. So, Minna, what is archaeobotany and what does it have to do with food history?
Archaeobotany is the science, botany, the science of plants, and archaeo is archaeological, something ancient. And so archaeobotany is the study of ancient plant remains that you find on archaeological sites. But plants are organic, they're very fragile. How do they survive? They survive. Sometimes somewhere like Egypt and in a lot of African countries and in South America, you get a lot of desiccated material because of the environment being incredibly arid. So plant material survives, but generally plant material often gets charred, gets burned, and this is how it survives in archaeological contexts. And we do what archaeobotany is, what the archaeobotanical material is, material that survives because people didn't eat it. Waste material, remains of animal fodder, types of fuel, and a lot of it gets discarded, and this is how it survives. But we still have a lot of material related to food production, related to cooking, and it tells us a lot about the species that were available to people, and sometimes we're able, from the archaeobotanical remains, to say how they would have been preparing them and storing them in the past. So this is what archaeobotany is, and it helps us through having the plant material. You're able to make more concrete assumptions about food history, because otherwise you have the texts, which are very important, but sometimes we don't always have the correct understanding or the correct translations of texts, and having the archaeobotanical material certainly adds another data set that can help us understand what people had access to, what they were eating, what they were cooking, and what they were cultivating.
That's fascinating. The fact that plants are treated as an artifact. Are they dead? Are they dead cells? Like, are the plants, do you find any that are still somehow?
No, there have been some attempts at trying to recultivate plants that were found desiccated from ancient Egyptian tombs with limited success, but usually they are charred, they're burnt, there's nothing really left to play with.
And I imagine seeds are something that is that might tell quite a lot. Is this something you find often?
Seeds.
Yeah.
Yes, that's mainly what survives because of leaves and other fragile parts usually don't survive, whether because even in desiccated format, sometimes they're too fragile, and certainly they don't survive being burnt or charred. So usually what we get are the seeds, the strong and sturdy parts of the plants.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I wasn't that great in biology, but I do remember they're the storage room of plants, right? They carry a lot of nutrients.
Yes. Well, you have the nutrients in many different parts of the plant, not just through the seed.
Fascinating. Now I have a question. Now the history of Egypt obviously spans, you know, over thousands and millennia. And when we try to describe, you know, an Egyptian diet from that time, I just think of how, you know, the ancient Egyptian history spans over so long, to the point that, for example, if you think of Cleopatra's age, which is around 50 BC, Cleopatra's actually closer to us than she was to the very early beginning of the Egyptian civilization, which was probably 3,000 years before her time, right?
Exactly. We are closer to Cleopatra, certainly.
It's fascinating when you think about it that way. How can we generalize, and how can we come up with, you know, a definition of an ancient Egyptian diet in that case, if it spans over millennia?
That's a very good point, because Egyptian cuisine is not one singular, nicely packaged thing. It changes a lot over history, and we've got millennia of change, of fashions, of trade, and also it is incredibly regional. So what we can, if we have evidence of a particular dish in a particular area, it's only relevant to that one area in that one time, and we can't generalize it and say that everyone in ancient Egypt was eating this throughout the 3,000 years of ancient Egypt. And there was a lot of consistency in ancient Egypt. There was a lot of consistency in the beliefs, in the funerary beliefs. And so some things remained consistent. And I think a lot of the basis of the diet would have remained consistent. Bread and beer, for example, would have been the cornerstones, in addition to things like lentils and onions and lettuce and things like this. I think would have continued throughout ancient Egypt with very, very little change. But certainly it is important to keep in mind that ancient Egypt is not a period of 50 years. And we can't make assumptions and overgeneralize about the entirety of Egyptian history just based on some evidence from ancient Egypt. Do you know what's actually happening in this scene? She's had a bit too much to drink and she's not feeling very well. It's not it's not necessarily representative of Egyptian history, or maybe Egyptians were drinking far too much throughout history.
So what do, actually, speaking of images and what they tell us, how much of what you use in your research depends on what is visually left on walls or on, you know, designs on artifacts? How much of that do you rely on?
We rely on it a lot, but they're all little bits of evidence And each type of evidence, of course, has its strengths and weaknesses, and we use them all. Tomb scenes are very interesting because they're highly curated, and they are meant to accompany the deceased in the afterlife to ensure that they have food in the afterlife. So it wasn't necessarily incredibly detailed. So when they show scenes of food production, like beer production or wine production, they don't necessarily show all the steps. And it's not meant to be a recipe. They were never meant to be seen by the living. It was meant to be, you bury someone, you seal the tomb, and khalas, you never go back there. I don't think they would have expected that there would come people thousands of years later and dig them out. So we do rely a lot on what they offer. And we've certainly learned a lot about bread production, beer production, wine production, and preparation of poultry, for example, not poultry, but ducks and geese, not chicken. That's important to remember. From ancient Egyptian tomb scenes. But they were not instructions on how to prepare something. And the offering scenes, we also get these scenes where you have the deceased and his wife would be seated in front of a big pile of fruits and vegetables and some bread and drinks, maybe beer and wine. And these also show us a lot about what people would have eaten, but it's again a very curated selection of food, and a lot of things that they would have been eating regularly were never appeared on tomb scenes, at least not that we're able to identify, like lentils, for example, which we have a lot of archaeobotanical evidence for lentils. We know that people were eating lentils, a lot of lentils, but we never see them on tomb scenes. So each type of evidence gives us little snippets, and when we put them together, we try to form as complete a picture as we can of ancient Egyptian diet.
That's amazing. Were any of these foods, like you said, the pile of, the pile of bowls of fruits and whatnot, or bounties and offerings and all that, that were depicted on these visuals, on these walls, for instance, were these meant to be just purely aesthetic and descriptive? Or did they have any symbolic meanings for certain, food items or fruits and vegetables and plants?
We don't know why certain fruits and vegetables made it into the tomb scenes. We don't know if it was a matter of personal decision. The deceased would say, they'd open up a catalog and look at all the designs and say, I want these fruits and these vegetables, or it was someone's personal favorites. I don't think that... We don't know if people really had a choice in what they were including in tomb scenes. Some foods may have had some kind of ritual connotations or religious connotations, but very often when we don't understand something, we just say it's a ritual. And we Egyptologists often call things ritualistic, even though they're just a random choice that we don't understand. So things like mandrake fruit had different sexual connotations. The lotus flower had connotations with resurrection and coming alive again, as well as fertility and sexual connotations. Probably what else? The foreleg of a cow was also, you often see like a leg of a cow in tomb scenes. This was a very important visual representation of an offering as well, that you get a lot of in ancient Egypt. So we do have some things that we think symbolized something more than just nutrition.
It's amazing. So like looking at, I think my voice is cutting, or can you hear me right?
No, I can hear you fine.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, we have this picture in front of us. Where was that? Because I see such images a lot, and I don't know whether they were just like all over all the walls and all the tombs, or are they in specific locations just for specific people or a certain hierarchy? Were these kings or Who were priests? Who are these?
So these beautiful, beautiful scenes that are very, very nicely colored, and they're just painted, they're not carved. They all come from the Theban necropolis, from the west bank of Luxor, where the nobility in the New Kingdom, so about 3,500 years ago, ish, where the nobility were buried. And a lot of them were affiliated with the court. So you had someone who was an overseer of the king's fields. Someone was a scribe. Someone was a military general. They were all high-ranking officials, and they're stunning. And we're very lucky because a lot of these scenes were drawn in the 19th century by early Egyptologists, beautifully drawn, beautifully replicated, and we have access to them because, of course, you can't just go into a tomb whenever you want to see something. It's nice to have these images available to us in such high quality and with these beautiful colors. So this is from the tomb of Nakht. He was an official in the New Kingdom in Thebes. And you see him sitting with his wife behind him, and they've got all the offerings, they've got the lotus and everything else.
Did they used to eat the lotus plant? Was it edible?
Herodotus, who wrote a lot about what Egyptians were up to, but we really need to take a lot of his writings with a grain of salt. He just sometimes made things up, and very often there are problems with the translation of his of particular expressions in his texts. But he said that the Egyptians at the time when he visited were eating lotus. And because we always have these beautiful lotus bundles with offering tables, I always wonder, is it just like a pretty garnish that they're putting, or is it actually meant to be eaten? I'm not sure, but we have the evidence of him saying that the ancient Egyptians ate it, or the Egyptians at the time ate it. And we have the evidence of them appearing on tomb scenes with food offerings, so perhaps.
So what was the poor man's diet then?
Bread, lentils, cheese, beer was incredibly nutritious, really, really thick, not just like the beer that we have today that is just watered down. Think of what a traditional peasant diet would have been in Egypt 100, 200 years ago, and I think it would have been very much the same. Ducks and geese would have probably been available for special occasions. Pigeons and quails as well would have been available for special occasions. Beef would have been very, very, very special. Pigs were more common, and you get people ate a lot of pigs, and of course Nilotic fish. People would have had fairly easy access to Nilotic fish. So it is a very varied diet with chait melon as well, atta, which we still eat now in Egypt, but is dying out. So people would have had a lot of vegetables and a lot of fruit as well.
And I'm sure the fruits and vegetables also varied a little bit throughout time.
Yes.
That's what we talked about, yeah.
Yes. So things like garlic, lettuce, chait melon were always there, but there was a point when they weren't. But they were there from very early on in Egyptian history. Pomegranate was a late introduction. It only came through the New Kingdom. And Egyptians have always had dates, but because Egyptians did not know how to, because they have to be manually, what's it called? By hand when you, التذكير لما نذكر النخل. I can't think of the word in English. They have to be artificially fertilized. That's not the right word, but I'll just use that. They have to be artificially, manually fertilized. Otherwise, you get a small crop and a really big tree, and not the best of dates. So there was a point when they didn't have access to that, and they had just the wild palm trees. And then there was a point when they started artificially pollinated. Thank you very much, Charles Perry is helping me there. Yes, so there was a point as well when they didn't have these beautiful big dates, and then they would have had access to them. What other things would have changed? I think these are just a few of the major changes that the ancient Egyptians had.
What about agriculture? I mean, agriculture advancement and its technology, as I'm sure many of us know, had a crucial part to play in shaping really every civilization, not just the Egyptian one. And it had a lot of consequences and later changes to the diet. What did you find drastically changed with it? Certain inventions, tools, specific methods?
So in the New Kingdom, about 3,000-ish, 3,500 years ago, the shadoof was introduced. And this helped cultivation to develop, and we were able to grow a few more crops than were available before, thanks to the shadoof. But throughout ancient Egypt, there were very little drastic developments in agricultural technologies. It wasn't until, so there's the introduction of the shadoof in the New Kingdom, and then in the Greco-Roman period, this is when you had major agricultural developments and land reclamation and new methods of digging canals and new canals being dug across the country that really changed the agricultural system. But throughout ancient Egypt itself, it was shadoof probably the biggest change, because people were reliant on the flooding of the Nile. And we were very lucky because we got this annual flood with very, very rich fertilizing soil that would cover the banks of the Nile. And then afterwards, people would be able to cultivate without much effort and much labor needed to prepare the land for cultivation.
I love to remember and remind myself that when we talk about like ancient Egypt, it did not exist in isolation. I mean, globalization isn't exactly new. We know that it was connected by trade. It was connected by human movement as well with other neighboring areas and other civilizations. Perhaps ones that existed also like along, the Nile or in Africa, but also, we think of Babylonians and Assyrians and who themselves, pioneered in agriculture and introduced a lot of new innovations as well in that sense. Are there any clear influences of such interaction between ancient Egypt and other areas?
I wish. So of course we know there's a lot of evidence of interaction, but in terms of food, I wish we had more evidence. So in addition to, for example, having the Egyptians having learned how to artificially pollinate the palm trees, things like pomegranates coming in, eventually chickens and all of that. This is always a question I have when Egyptians interacted with non-Egyptians. What kind of food knowledge went back and forth? What did people gain from the Egyptians and what did we gain from the others? And especially when we got a lot of people in, for example, in the Middle Kingdom, settling down in Egypt, coming in from Asia and from the Levant. And how did they impact the local cuisine? For sure, they brought in a lot of their own food preparation techniques, even flavors. Maybe they may not have brought in their actual foodstuffs with them because it was a long journey. But we don't really have evidence. And the problem for that is we don't have a lot of sites where are archaeological sites where you can see clearly people coming in from elsewhere, settling, and you don't have the archaeobotanical levels, the strata of archaeobotanical remains that show you a change in the diet, or we don't have the right information to help us figure out how they would have been affecting the local diet, unfortunately. But we know about some of that in the south, on the borders with Nubia, where there were Egyptian fortresses all along the south of Egypt, between Egypt and Nubia. And
was that the Kush kingdom?
So it wasn't always called Kush, but it's at the south of Egypt, at the borders. And the borders changed all the time, of course. They weren't always fixed borders. But you had the Egyptian soldiers and the Egyptian administrators living in these fortresses, adopting, in a lot of cases, some Nubian traditions in their diets. They must have been settling and marrying local women. And sometimes you get with the ceramics, you see that they were probably cooking Egyptian foods in the Egyptian ceramics. We know this through chemical analysis, and they would have been cooking the Nubian foods in the Nubian ceramics. And so there was very, very clear cultural exchange in terms of food happening at the borders.
That's really, really interesting. I would like to ask you about the Coptic monastery food and that region. I know you've done some of your studies on that topic specifically. What were some of the most interesting findings from that time period, and perhaps also as a transition to link to what we've discussed before in ancient Egypt? Like, around what time are we talking about?
So a lot of this is around the 3rd, 4th century AD. And Coptic Christianity continues until today. So if you're talking about, a little like talking about ancient Egypt, when you can't make overgeneralization about the Coptic diet based on something really, really old or really, really new. So this is from the early 20th century, this image. And there was, talking about the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries AD, Coptic monasteries were extremely, I want to call them maybe economic hubs. Wherever they were, they had a lot of not archaeological lands, agricultural lands. They had agricultural lands. They were important food producers for themselves and for their communities around them as well, the secular communities living around them that may not necessarily be affiliated with the monastic settlement itself.
So how did you, when you look at their sites, when you visit their sites, for instance, how do you, what main differences do you see in that time period as opposed to, let's say, Cleopatra's time?
In terms of the diet, how is the Coptic diet different? Again, I can't make generalizations about the Coptic diet. And very often, I don't think the Coptic diet would have been much more different from, so in the early days of Christianity, from the pagans, from the ancient Egyptian, or the ancient Egyptians, the Egyptians, who are still adhering to the pagan religions. And I don't think the diet differs much from when Islam came in. So you can't really pinpoint a Coptic, how was the Coptic diet different? They would have been eating the same food, with the exception of course, the vegan diets that they followed. And they would have had, of course, more variety of vegan foods that they would have been eating, that are slightly different than what the non-Copts would have been eating, or at least those who aren't adhering to the same strict fasts.
Yeah. So I've been taking a few looks at the images, some of the images that you've been sharing on Instagram, and there's a lot of, mentions to fruits and vegetables and certain dishes with certain fruits. And it seems like there are certain ones that keep popping and that might not have, that we don't necessarily know now. Is there such plants that were once there but are not available to us anymore?
There are things that are dying out. Things like sycamore figs, for example, are dying out. Ziziphus spinacristi are dying out. But I can't think of anything specific that has completely died out and is no longer available. Tiger nuts are also dying out and are becoming very, very difficult to find.
What are tiger nuts called in Arabic?
Hab al-Aziz.
Oh, okay.
So these are cousins of papyrus. They're little tubers that we found a lot of in ancient Egyptian tombs. And one of the earliest things we can refer to, that we can maybe call a recipe from ancient Egypt, was a recipe of tiger nuts made with dates and honey, sort of like a cake almost.
Was it like crushed like into a...
Yes, it was crushed. It was crushed. The tiger nuts were ground into powder or flour, and then they were mixed with fat and the dates and the honey.
Amazing. What sort of fats were available at the time? Was it olive oil or?
No, they wouldn't have had olive oil. Olive oil didn't happen until the Greco-Roman period, or with the Greeks. This is when olive oil production really expanded. We do have evidence of olive oil production earlier than that, but it was very minimal. But a lot of animal fats. This would have been one of the most common and readily available sorts of fats to the ancient Egyptian.
Fascinating. So you mentioned pomegranates were there, and if I'm not mistaken, grapes were introduced in the Roman period?
Grapes, no, you have grapes from the early dynastic period, you get grapes very, very early on in Egyptian history, but it's not, but wine production expanded considerably in the Greco-Roman period, but we were still producing wine well before that.
And are there any, like, how do you basically come to the conclusion that, let's say, an artifact has traces of wine? I know there's a lot of science that gets involved with the testing the chemical remains that you mentioned. How difficult is that?
Well, probably for you and I, it would be very difficult because I don't do the chemistry, but for a lab technician or a scientist or someone familiar with it, it'd be very easy. But you get, you can take samples of the residues from the inside of ceramic vessels, for example, that helps you figure out what were the contents of this vessel. For example, you do get a lot of wine vessels, and sometimes you can tell because of the acid surviving that you had wine in this particular vessel. So we're lucky we live at a time where archaeological sciences are a thing, and you're able to conduct a variety of scientific methodologies to learn more about the archaeological material that you have.
Fascinating. This picture that we have is of a recipe. I believe it was later in the history of Egypt, much later, if I'm not mistaken, the Islamic Fatimids, maybe 14th century. Yeah. 14th. So what would be your ultimate historical recipe that is your favorite? You've maybe perhaps tried and you really liked? And
Tofahiyya. Tofahiyya is a beef and apple stew from the 14th century from Kanz al-Fawaid fi Tanwi' al-Mawayid, and it's a very easy recipe to make. It's very quick, it's very flavorful, it freezes very well, so you can make a big batch and freeze it, and it doesn't taste too defrosted when you defrost it and heat it again. It's a wonderful dish, and it's always very surprising because when people try historical food for the first time, they don't really know what to expect. And when they taste something like tufahiyya, it's such a shock to their senses because it's so flavorful and, in a sense, incredibly modern to their palates. And so they can't believe that the Egyptians were cooking this 1,000 years or 600 years ago.
600 years ago, that would make it what century? Tufahiyya? Also medieval, right?
14th.
14th
medieval
as well.
Well, we shouldn't always use the word medieval, but Mamluk, it's a Mamluk recipe.
Mamluk. Do you find that I was just having this conversation actually with a friend of mine today, talking about how flavors and the sense of taste, a specific or an appreciation of specific flavor might change from one place to another, and perhaps from one time to another in the case of Egypt. I know that at probably the 13th century or 14th century, maybe a little bit before that, there was a lot of mixing of sour and sweet, for instance, in certain dishes. Perhaps now it would be a little bit different to our taste palette. How do you see that? Is that something you've noticed throughout time in Egypt?
Certainly, people's palates change, fashions come and go. And this is one of the questions that we always ask ourselves when we're thinking of food history, because especially when we're doing experimental archaeology or experimental cooking of ancient recipes or historical recipes, we try to figure out how people wanted things to taste, but this is something we will never know, especially because we don't know how the actual raw ingredients would have tasted. Of course, flavors have the raw ingredients themselves change. The fruits and the vegetables don't taste the same, and the varieties are not even the same. A lot of what we eat today and what we have access to has been altered throughout years, whether by just a farmer's selection or by intentional genetic modification. So we can never really know what people's palates were like. We don't know how much salt they wanted. If you have a text, someone complaining that there was too much salt in the food, you don't know just what that actually means. And when you're recreating recipes or experimentally trying to recreate recipes, you're always bound by that we will never really know what it tastes like.
Yeah, it's always subjective. I mean, at least for my husband, it has to be very salty. I can't stand it. I'm going to move on to fava beans. So we've asked you to share with us one single ingredient and talk to us more about it. And you chose fava beans. Why did you?
When I went to do my master's in England, I packed a full pot with me, the special fava bean pot where we use to stew the fava beans overnight. And I took the little hot plate with me. And every time I had, a few months before I traveled, every time I had someone going back to England, I'd give them a couple of kilos of fava beans because I couldn't dream of being stuck anywhere without my fava beans. And I would always make them and I'd freeze them and I would have fava beans in England whenever I wanted. And so for me, it's a very important dish that I actually do, and I do eat it every single day. I never have a problem. I never get tired of it. But it's very interesting because of its history in Egypt, because there is an assumption that I also once held, that the ancient Egyptians ate fava beans, and the fava beans have been here since time immemorial. And I can't remember why, but a few years ago, I decided to check. Yes, I remember now. I wanted to find out when and how fava beans became a staple. I wanted to understand how they became a staple. And so I started looking at all the examples of archaeobotanical finds of fava beans from archaeological sites across Egyptian history. And I found that the material that we have from ancient Egyptian archaeological sites is next to nothing. We only have about 5 or 6 ancient Egyptian archaeological sites with remains of fava beans. And when I started looking at each individual site and reading the original reports of the archaeobotanists or the archaeologists who were excavating it and how they identified the grains, I started thinking that they were probably modern contaminations. For example, there's one or two fava. I'm not going to, rewrite history based on 1 or 2 fava beans, but there are a couple of fava beans that were found in a causeway related to a temple in Giza, not in Giza, in Abu Sir, and there were fava beans in the causeway. So I'll ask myself, what were the processes or activities that happened that resulted in fava beans being on the causeway where they would celebrate the cult of the dead king? Why would there be fava beans in there? And I came to the conclusion that it's probably a modern contamination from the workmen that were excavating the site, because very often we eat fava beans for second breakfast on archaeological sites and things fall. And things get, litter the site. It does happen. And when I looked at every single example of fava beans from ancient Egypt, every single one, with the exception of one, is a very questionable context. A tomb that has been ransacked by looters in the 17th century. Yes, of course, and has fava beans, then it's probably not an ancient Egyptian deposit of fava beans, but probably a modern contamination. And again, you have 1 or 2 grains that don't really allow you to say much. But then when you look at starting the Greco-Roman period, there's an explosion in fava beans being found on archaeological sites. Suddenly, they went from a handful of sites with 1 or 2 fava beans each to dozens of sites. Maybe dozens is very generous, maybe a dozen sites or a few more sites with sometimes up to 100 fava bean grains discovered. And that allowed me to come to the conclusion that it seems that the ancient Egyptians did not eat fava beans. We don't know whether they had them at all. Maybe they never did. Maybe they were cultivated, but people never ate them. I'm fairly certain that they wouldn't have fed them to the animals, because we would have had a lot of remains from the animal dung, because when animals eat, part of whatever they're eating survives in their dung, and it becomes, it's used as fuel and it's burnt and it becomes nicely charred, and you get a lot of the material that the animal fodder consisted of. So I don't think that the ancient Egyptians were eating fava beans. Something happened in the Greco-Roman period. I can't tell what it is. But led to fava beans becoming immensely popular. And this is probably, I can assume, although I'm very, very cautiously assuming, that this may have been the time when they became a staple. And how they became a staple, I'm not really sure. I can't tell, unfortunately. We still need more research in understanding that step.
A curious case of the fool of the fava bean in Egypt. Yes. Amazing. I'll definitely come back to you later and get a recipe of how to stew the fava beans properly from you. Minna, I want to jump quickly to a fun Q&A. What are you reading or watching right now?
Watching Blacklist. Reading, I just finished reading, I can't even remember it. It wasn't a very good book. It was just fiction. And I'm starting to read a book called Taste, A History of Taste, I think. So I'm reading that right now, or about to start reading that.
I think of it crossed, we crossed paths. I can't remember the author though, but yeah, that's definitely, I mean, any book with word history and food is something on my list. I'll have to go back and check it. Thank you for that. What about your, let's say, someone who you would want to shadow for one day? Could be from the past, the present, perhaps the future. Future Minna.
Future Minna. I would be very cheesy and say I would like to shadow an ancient Egyptian for a day. so I can come back and tell all Egyptologists that a lot of our assumptions about ancient Egypt are wrong.
I was waiting for that. I was waiting. I was like, I bet she's going to say an ancient Egypt. I mean, who wouldn't want to? Of course. As an Egyptologist and probably even just an Egyptian, you know, to see how their life was like in one day. And yeah.
Yes, I follow someone cooking.
Yeah, for sure. A baker, a good baker. What about your midnight food choice? A guilty pleasure?
Crisps, but I have no guilt. It's just pleasure.
Crisps as in the British chips.
Well, British crisps, yes.
Nice. A salty? What flavor then?
Salt, just salt.
And what about some dish that reminds you most of home, other than fool? Fool doesn't count though. You already told us the story.
Molokhia.
Yes, absolutely. With good ta'liya and kuzbara and tom.
And with pickled onions and rice, and then whether chicken or rabbit, everything all mixed together. Yes, molokhia.
And a good bed of rice. It makes good winter days.
Yeah.
Oh, Minna, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. I'd like to open up the space for the remaining few moments that we have to the participants, the audience, and see if they've got any questions. I'm going to head over to the chat and read some. So the first one we got is from Charles Perry. I expect there may be little evidence of dairy products from antiquity, but do you have any thoughts about how old mish is? Thank you, Charles, for this question. I was curious about cheese myself, so I'm happy that came out.
Unfortunately, we don't have evidence that we can securely interpret as mish from ancient Egypt, but we do have quite a few examples of cheese, and we get cheese that is mixed with bovine and ovicaprid milk. So it's nice to see that they were mixing different types of milk together in some cases, but I'm afraid I can't really tell you how old mish is. But I can tell you something, cottage cheese, the way it's wrapped up in those mats today, we had certainly ancient Egyptian, 100%.
The same, what do you call it?
Like with the reed
hasir.
mat.
Reeds, yes.
With the hasir. Yeah, I'm quite confident that it's ancient Egyptian.
That's amazing. I mean, it's nice because it leaves a print on the cheese. And only recently did I realize that it is from that. I just thought it's like some sort of like a design with the fork. But then I realized it's actually how it's rolled to dry and kind of drain the liquid part of it out, which is fascinating. Another question is on the Nubian diet, if you can elaborate which was found on the Nubian, any Nubian diet which was found on the ceramics on the southern border. Have you perhaps found any influence or remnants of that?
So yes, the Egyptian pots had that I mentioned that we'd done, well, the archaeologists had done chemical analysis on. The Egyptian pots usually tended to have fish, which was incredibly Egyptian, and the Nubian pots would have a lot more wild game. And I can, if you'd like, I can send you the article that delineates that, because there are a lot more details with that I don't have all the details in my head, and I can send you the article for that.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great. The person who posted the question is Omar. So perhaps, Omar, if you would like to share your email here in the chat, so maybe Minna can send you the article. That would be great. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Is about wheat. What kind of wheat was used?
In ancient Egypt, we had Triticum dicoccum, which was emmer wheat, and that continued until the introduction of free threshing wheats in the Greco-Roman, well, in the Hellenistic period. And this is when we started getting Triticum durum wheat, and then later Triticum aestivum was introduced. And exactly the switch from emmer to free threshing wheats is, there's a lot of research ongoing now that is allowing us to redefine some of our theories on the switch from emmer to free threshing wheats.
Amazing. The question I forgot to mention was from Margie. Thank you, Margie, for the question. And then Mustafa Al-Hakim is asking slightly tangential question, but in the slide with a picture of Al-Qubays, there was a picture of two fruit-shaped pottery vases that I have seen more recently around. Is there any historical significance to the shape or pottery style? I think he means the
pomegranates.
Yeah, I can.
So these both represent pomegranate fruits, and there is an assumption that the bigger yellow one would have been for pomegranate juice, just regular juice, and that the smaller one would have been for unripe, sour pomegranate juice. And there's an assumption that it would have been for medical purposes. This is what is believed, but yeah, they're pomegranate vessels and they're very pretty, and you do get some of them in ancient Egypt. Well, they're not incredibly common, but you do get a few of them, but by far these are the most beautiful. You also have one in silver, but these are the prettiest.
Minna, was it juice or could it have been molasses, or like pomegranate molasses?
We don't know.
Okay.
We don't know.
So the remnants scientifically would be more or less the same if it was, you know, one or the other.
Yes, the signature, the chemical signature would be identical or very similar, but also I don't think they've actually done any residue analysis on these. I think the assumption is just based on the shape.
Amazing. Well, I believe these are all the questions we've got. And if you'd like to reach out to Minna for any other questions later on, this is her Instagram handle, Eat Like an Egyptian. Minna, it's been an unbelievable pleasure hosting you and having this conversation with you tonight, learning so much more about ancient Egyptian foodways. And I'd like to thank you so much and thank our audience for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Salma, for moderating and arranging the questions. And thank you very much to Afikra and Mikey for inviting me. And thank you to everyone who's joined and listened to us chat. And thank you for your questions.
Please give us any feedback if you enjoyed tonight's conversation and have any suggestions. And because Afikra is powered by you and powered by all the volunteers and the community, there are always ways to support. So head over to learn more about ways to support. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a great rest of the evening, wherever you are, or morning or day. And just keep following us, and good night, everyone. Thank you.